Welcome to A Cloud of Witnesses. This is an in-depth series on the history of the Christian faith. In this video, we'll be examining the Christian faith in North America during the 17th century. We'll be looking at different groups, such as the Pilgrims, who were a separatist group who arrived in the area of New England in 1720. We'll also look at the impact of the Puritans, who began arriving in New England shortly after. We'll focus on a couple of key individuals such as John Winthrop, Roger Williams, and John Eliot, and note their relationship with the Native American Indians. We'll also examine persecution, looking at groups such as the Quakers and the Baptists, and William Penn's establishment of the Pennsylvania colony, and based on the principle of religious freedom. We will conclude with a brief discussion of the disturbing events surrounding the Salem Witch Trials. As we have noted, South America had been settled by Catholics from Portugal and Spain. The first permanent European settlement on the American East Coast was the Spanish settlement of St. Augustine, which was established in the year 1565. While to the far north of North America, there'd be Catholics from France. But in central North America, there'd be Protestants of all different denominational persuasions. Although the English had established Jamestown in 1607, we're going to look at the arrival of the so-called Pilgrims and the establishment of the colony at Plymouth in 1620. In 1608, the independent congregation that met in Scrooby under the leadership of John Robinson fled to Holland. Robinson had the idea of starting a new colony in the New World, principally North America. But it would be one of the members, William Bradford, who would later be an important leader of the group there. It's likely that the name Pilgrims came from the writings of William Bradford, who, when describing their departure from Leyden in 1620, quoted from Hebrews 11:13, which says that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. In 1620, the group from Robinson's church, along with others from England, sailed for New England, part of North America, aboard the Mayflower. They planned to set up a new community there, one which would be based on religious freedom. And as mentioned, this group was known as the Pilgrims. Before landing, the Pilgrims drew up the Mayflower Compact, which was a set of guidelines for governance. Basically, it was an extension of the covenant idea to civil government. They arrived during winter. Of the 100 or so that had landed, soon around 50 had died. At one stage, there were only half a dozen that were well, and they were looking after the rest. However, by the autumn of 1621, they celebrated their first successful harvest. They invited, or possibly they turned up and were welcomed, about 90 Indian braves whom they'd befriended to this special celebration feast. And this began the American tradition of Thanksgiving. Their colony had survived and it became the second American colony to succeed. Today, the location is Plymouth in Massachusetts. The other colony was Jamestown, which was further to the south in Virginia, and it had been established in 1607. The Pilgrims at Plymouth, and later the Puritans at Boston, were not moving into empty lands. There were many Indian tribes that were living in these areas. The Wampanoag, the Narragansett, and the Pequot would all be significant in the ensuing years as the colonies of New England expanded. North America was first permanently settled in 1607 by 144 settlers who arrived at Jamestown, Virginia. This settlement was Anglican, and among the settlers was a chaplain, yet it would not be accurate to describe this as a religious community. In the year 1619, slavery was introduced at this settlement in order to work the tobacco crops, and the repercussions of this are still being felt in the US to this very day. The colony at Jamestown struggled through the plague, wars with Indians, and famine through to the year 1623. Unfortunately, it was tobacco that brought income and enabled the struggling colony to survive. Some Roman Catholics settled in Maryland, but eventually the Anglican Church became the established church there, as it did in the states of North and South Carolina. So in the southern colonies, the Anglican Church was stronger, but Congregationalism or dissenters were stronger in the area of New England. As already mentioned, the Pilgrim Fathers settled in what would become the city of Plymouth, in the area of New England in 1620. These were separatists, and eventually non-separatist Puritans would cross the Atlantic to New England as well. While many of these first Puritans maintained the links with the so-called Mother Church, in other words, the Church of England, others underwent changes in religious practices, such as the removing of the prayer books and the set prayers, and some of these would eventually set up a congregational system of church government. Over 20,000 Puritans came to the New England settlements between the years 1628 to 1640. One who arrived with the first Pilgrims was William Bradford. The year following their arrival, in 1621, he was chosen as Plymouth Governor, a position he was re-elected to 30 times throughout his life. In 1650, Bradford wrote History of the Plymouth Plantation, and he reflected back on the development of that first settlement, a development he attributed to God's providence. He also talked of the settlement as being a light to the whole nation, a thought later taken up with John Winthrop's A City on a Hill. Of small beginnings, great things have been produced by his hand, and as one small candle may light 1,000, so the light there kindled hath shone to many, yea, in some sort to our whole nation. Let the glorious name of Jehovah have all the praise. Prior to the arrival of the Pilgrims in Plymouth in 1620, the Dutch had already begun to settle, mainly along the rivers Nort and Zuid, what are today called the Hudson and Delaware rivers. The earliest Dutch settlement was built around 1613, and consisted of a number of small huts. Soon after, the first of 2 small trading posts went up, where trade could be conducted with the local Algonquian and Iroquois population. Then in 1617, Dutch colonists built a fort at the confluence of the Hudson and the Mohawk rivers, where the city of Albany in New York State now stands. By the year 1624, with the arrival of Dutch settlers, the so-called New Netherland became a province of the Dutch Republic, and eventually New Amsterdam, the site of modern-day New York, became its capital. Of course, the Dutch brought with them the Dutch Reformed Church, and so a form of Presbyterianism was established in North America. By 1664, King Charles II of England resolved to annex New Netherland and to, quote, bring all his kingdoms under one form of government, both in church and state, and to install the Anglican government as in Old England. After a long and protracted conflict, in 1674, the Treaty of Westminster concluded the war and thus ceded New Netherland to the English. The next important group following the Pilgrims was the Massachusetts Bay Colony. In 1628, they were given a royal charter or royal permission to settle in New England. This was given by the king, and regarding the Native Americans, the charter expressed the desire that settlers, by their good life and orderly conversation, might win and invite the natives of that country to the knowledge and obedience of the only true God and Saviour of mankind, and Christian faith. Note that the emphasis here was not on conversion through evangelism by proclamation and mission. In 1630, John Winthrop led a group of English Puritans to the New World. His group established the second major colony in New England, and this was known as the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Winthrop is well known for his City Upon a Hill sermon, which he preached on board the ship prior to their arrival in New England. In this sermon, he declared that the Puritan colonists were part of a special covenant with God to create a holy community, and that the wealthy had a duty to look after the poor. Here's an extract from that sermon.
Now, the only way to avoid this shipwreck and to provide for our posterity is to follow the counsel of Micah, to do justly, to love mercy, to walk humbly with our God. For this end we must be knit together in this work as one man. We must entertain each other in brotherly affection. We must be willing to abridge ourselves of our superfluities for the supply of others' necessities. We must uphold a familiar commerce together in all meekness, gentleness, patience, and liberality. We must delight in each other, make others' conditions our own, rejoice together, mourn together, labor and suffer together, always having before our eyes our commission and community in the work as members of the same body. So shall we keep the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. The Lord will be our God and delight to dwell among us as his own people, and will command a blessing upon us in all our ways, so that we shall see much more of his wisdom, power, goodness, and truth than formerly we have been acquainted with. We shall find that the God of Israel is among us, when 10 of us shall be able to resist 1,000 of our enemies, when he shall make us a praise and a glory that men shall say of succeeding plantations, the Lord make it like that of New England. For we must consider that we shall be as a city upon a hill. The eyes of all people are upon us, so that if we shall deal falsely with our God in this work we have undertaken, and so cause him to withdraw his present help from us, we shall be made a story and a byword through the world.
They arrived in 1630 and set up at what today is Boston in Massachusetts. Winthrop was not only their spiritual leader, but also the governor of the new colony. It's said that his rule was authoritarian. The Massachusetts Bay Colony were not separatists, and there was little toleration for dissenters, as Roger Williams would find out. The arrival of the new colonists was a disaster for the native inhabitants, principally the Wampanoag, who contracted new diseases which decimated their numbers. However, not all saw this as a bad thing. Winthrop saw the providence of God at work, as it enabled the new settlers to occupy the vacated lands. But for the natives in these parts, God hath so pursued them, as for 300 miles space the greatest part of them are swept away by smallpox, which still continues among them. So, as God hath thereby cleared our title to this place, those who remain in those parts, being in all not 50, have put themselves under our protection. Sadly, during his time as governor, he presided over the slaughter of hundreds of Pequot Indians and the enslavement of many more. This occurred during and then after the Pequot Wars, which took place between the years 1636 to 1638. The phrase manifest destiny was first used in 1845. Yet the concept behind the phrase originated much earlier and was influenced by the Puritans in general and by Winthrop's sermon, The City on the Hill, specifically. Manifest destiny is the idea or belief that the United States is destined by God to expand its dominion and spread democracy and capitalism. It's been stated that it encompasses, quote, the concept of American exceptionalism, the belief that America occupies a special place among the countries of the world. There are, of course, dangers in holding such a theological position as this. The founding of the colony of Connecticut began when two Puritan ministers, Thomas Hooker and Samuel Stone, led a group of about 100 Puritans, establishing the settlement of Hartford in 1636. This was in the tribal area of the Matabesic Indians. It's thought that Thomas Hooker was the inspiration for the writing of what is called Fundamental Orders of Connecticut, which some have called the world's first written democratic constitution, establishing a representative government. A royal charter for land in what would become Maryland was granted to Cecil Calvert, the Lord of Baltimore, by King Charles I in 1632. Essentially, a royal charter was that he could rent the land from the king. Significantly, Lord Baltimore was a Catholic, and the Maryland colony would become initially a haven for Catholics. Baltimore's first settlers arrived in the new colony in 1634, and with them were two Jesuit priests. However, Baltimore himself never visited the colony. However, with the arrival of Puritans from Virginia, the Catholics were always a minority in Maryland. The Maryland colony also became a haven for other dissenters through the Maryland Toleration Act of 1649. This act mandated religious tolerance for all Trinitarian Christians. Although with the so-called Glorious Revolution of 1688 in England, Catholicism was outlawed in Maryland and many Catholic churches were burnt. This law remained in place until the American War of Independence in 1776. Around 1683, Presbyterianism was established in Maryland, and then in 1706, a presbytery was established in Philadelphia in Pennsylvania, and many Scottish and Irish Presbyterians began to arrive in the early 18th century, escaping oppression at home. Roger Williams was an English Puritan theologian who left England during Laud's leadership of the church. He arrived at Boston in 1631, where he came into disagreement with the Puritans of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and eventually had to flee. He was concerned with the fact that Winthrop was not only the leader of the church, but also the governor, who did not tolerate religious dissent. In response, he put forward the idea of the separation of church and state. He used the phrase that there should be a wall of separation. He opposed the prevailing idea of a state church and that a magistrate had rightful power over a man's religion. He argued, an enforced uniformity of religion throughout a nation or civil state confounds the civil and religious, denies the principles of Christianity and civility. Of course, his concern was not just with Winthrop. It was indeed with the authority of the Church of England under control of kings, who also did not tolerate dissent. So his was an argument for religious independence, not that Christians should lose the right to advocate for just laws and so influence the state. His views on this separation were taken up by Thomas Jefferson and other founding fathers of America, and this became one of the foundational principles of the Constitution of the United States. Williams was also an advocate for fair dealings with Native Americans. He insisted that any land settled by Europeans should be purchased fairly from the local tribe, and he opposed any forceful conversion. He said his sole desire was to do the natives good. He founded the city of Providence on Rhode Island, and this colony was to be based on the principle of equality and liberty of conscience. It would become a haven for Baptists and Quakers and others who were persecuted for their beliefs. In 1652, Rhode Island passed the first law in North America making slavery illegal. Williams also became a Baptist, and he established arguably the first Baptist church in America in 1638. Yet later in life, he was not truly involved in any one church. However, there was intertribal conflict between the Narragansett and the neighbouring Pequot tribe. The colonists took the side of the Narragansett, and in addition claimed that the Pequot had committed atrocities against other Indian tribes and against Dutch and British settlers as well. While the circumstances of what took place and who was at fault, ultimately, with the assistance of Roger Williams, a force of Boston Puritans, along with some of the other tribes, attacked the Pequot fort at Mystic. They set the fort on fire, and about 500 Indian braves were killed, along with women and children. Those who survived were sold into slavery. Many years later, Roger Williams, who was now in his 70s, was at the settlement of Providence, dealing with the aftermath of another conflict with the Indians, and this was known as the King Philip's War. This was fought between the Wampanoag and the colonists, and the war had resulted in the death of about 40% of the Wampanoag tribe and resulted in their defeat. The question was what to do with those Indians that had survived, and Williams formed a committee that urged the town to sell them into servitude and to divide the profits. As a consequence, many male Wampanoag were sold into slavery in Bermuda or the West Indies, and some women and children were enslaved by colonists in New England. In terms of reaching the Indians, John Eliot had a different approach. Mission and evangelism were important parts of his ministry. Eliot arrived in New England, in Boston, in 1631 and became a minister and a teaching elder, and then a pastor at the First Church of Roxby, which is just south of Boston, a position he held for 40 years. There he began to learn the language of the local Indian tribe, the Wampanoag language, through a young captured Native American servant of a friend. He began working among the Native Americans in 1646. Thomas Mayhew established the first European settlement on the island called Martha's Vineyard and became its governor in 1642. There were, at the time of his arrival, about 3,000 inhabitants from the Wampanoag Indian tribe, and right from the outset, Thomas and his son, also called Thomas, established good relationships with the tribe. It was agreed that no land should be taken from them unless consent was given and proper payment made. From this time on, the settlement avoided later bloodshed that inflicted other settlements in New England. While the Mayhews wanted to share their faith, initially the Wampanoag were not interested. However, over time, some became curious about the white man's God. Eventually, the Indian, Quakers, expressed an interest, and Thomas Mayhew Jr. invited him into his home, where he taught him English and explained to him the Christian faith. In return, Quakers taught him the Wampanoag language, and as soon as he was able to converse in that language, Mayhew would travel the island speaking to the Indians, explaining the Christian message to them in their own language. And soon a small Christian community emerged. This is reputed to be the oldest house still standing on Martha's Vineyard. It was originally a meeting house built by Thomas Mayhew Jr. in 1656 as a place for the Christians of the Wampanoag to gather. It was called Makak Honki, which is the Wampanoag word for land of congregation or land of assembly. Eventually, the news of the work of John Eliot and Thomas Mayhew among the Indians of North America reached England, and this led to the formation of the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in New England in 1649. In 1657, Thomas Mayhew left for England in order to raise some financial support for the work among the Indians. But the boat and all those on board were never heard of again. Meanwhile, John Eliot was having great success among the Indians he was working with. Through learning their language, he translated the Old and New Testaments in the Algonquian Indian language. The Algonquian language family stretched almost across North America. Then, through the financial support of the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in New England, Eliot was able in 1663 to have the first Indian Bible printed. He was also able to establish a number of Christian villages, and by 1674 there were 14 with nearly 3,600 Christian Indians, and these were given the name of praying villages. In these villages, no whites were allowed to live, and Eliot organised a form of self-government based on the pattern given in Exodus 18, where the leaders or judges were appointed over the people as leaders of thousands, of hundreds, of fifties, and of tens. In addition, almost all of the evangelisation was carried out by personally trained Indian evangelists, of which there were about a dozen. Eliot also taught the Indians trades, agriculture, and other academic subjects, and later he sent some of them to the newly established University of Harvard in Massachusetts in order that they might be trained as pastors. Sadly, hostilities and mutual suspicion increased between the whites and the Indians, and then in 1675 what has been called King Philip's War broke out. Led by the Wampanoag chief Metacomb, it is called King Philip's War because he had adopted the name Philip due to his father's initially friendly relations with the Pilgrims when they had first arrived. However, now blaming the colonists for violating peace treaties, a war had broken out. Soon, the Narragansett tribe were dragged into the conflict, and by the end, the Wampanoag and the Narragansett tribes were virtually wiped out. Most of the Indian villages established by Eliot were damaged or destroyed. Many of the Indian Christians had joined the war, and many were relocated. So the Indian Wars of 1675 effectively ended most of Eliot's work. From the mid-17th century, other nationalities and in particular other religious groups had begun arriving in the New World. For example, from 1656 onwards, many Quakers began arriving from England. Then many Huguenots from France, and this was due to the Edict of Fontainebleau of 1685. Then Germans, many who were Lutherans influenced by Pietism, and they came because of the conflict of the 30 Years' War, and others came to escape persecution. There were many Anabaptists, mainly Mennonites from Germany from the years 1683 onwards. There were Scottish-Irish Presbyterians from 1710 onwards, and Moravians from the 1730s. All this made a rich tapestry of religious groups in the developing colonies of North America. By the mid-1600s, George Fox, in England, had begun a movement called the Quakers, and many of his followers faced severe persecution there, and we'll look at this in detail in the coming video. The first Quakers began arriving in Massachusetts in 1656. They were hoping to find more tolerance there. However, the predominantly Puritan settlement did not tolerate dissenting groups, and by October of that year, the death penalty was decreed against any Quaker who would return after being banished from that colony. William Sewell, in his account, The History of the Rise, Increase and Progress of the Christian People Called Quakers, written in 1717, described the persecution of Quakers even before laws were made against them. It was in the month called July of this present year, i.e. 1656, when Mary Fisher and Anne Austen arrived in the road before Boston, before ever a law was made there against the Quakers. And yet they were very ill treated. For before they came ashore, the Deputy Governor, Richard Bellingham, the Governor himself being out of town, sent officers aboard who searched their trunks and chests and took away the books they found there, which were about 100, and carried them ashore after having commanded the women to be kept prisoners aboard. And the said books were, by an order of the council, burnt in the marketplace by the hangman. The Boston Martyrs is the name given to the execution of 4 Quakers by hanging by the Massachusetts Puritan leader in 1660. And this event actually ended the Puritan theocracy when Charles II forbade the execution of anyone professing Quakerism in the following year. Baptists were also treated harshly in Massachusetts. In 1651, the colony was visited by 3 Rhode Islanders who'd become Baptists. They were treated harshly and they were imprisoned. John Cotton, who was considered the preeminent minister and theologian of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, preached against the heinousness of these Anabaptist opinions. The 3 were given fines and were paid for, but in one case, he refused to allow anyone to pay his fine, and as a result, he was publicly and severely whipped. Movements for more tolerance in religion began to be seen in other locations. An example of this was the so-called Flushing Remonstrance in the New Netherland colony. The Flushing Remonstrance was a petition of 1657 made to Director General of the New Netherland, Peter Stuyvesant. Stuyvesant had, the year before, formally banned all religions other than the Dutch Reformed Church from being practiced in the colony, in accordance with the laws of the Dutch Republic. However, about 30 residents of the small settlement of Flushing opposed his ban and requested a greater toleration, in particular to the Quakers and Baptists, who had suffered due to the policies of Stuyvesant.
Right Honourable Governor Stuyvesant, on behalf of the inhabitants of the town of Flushing, please accept this remonstrance, our respectful protest. You have been pleased to send unto us a certain command that we should not receive any of those people called Quakers. But for our part, we cannot condemn them, nor can we stretch out our hands against them, for from Christ God only comes a consuming and loving fire. We desire, therefore, not to judge, lest we be judged, nor to condemn, lest we be condemned, but rather let every man stand or fall on his own.
Sadly, this appeal for religious tolerance or freedom of conscience was not taken up by him. He imprisoned 2 of those who had signed the petition, while another 2 had recanted their position under pressure. And he also set aside a day of prayer for the purpose of repenting from the sin of religious tolerance. William Penn received a land grant from King Charles II, and in 1681 the colony of Pennsylvania was formed. This would be a colony founded on religious freedom and it became an important haven for both Quakers and Baptists and others who faced persecution. Penn, who was involved in the project but remained in England, drafted a so-called Charter of Liberties for the settlement, and in this charter he guaranteed free and fair trial by jury, the freedom of religion, the freedom from unjust imprisonment, and free elections. The Salem Witch Trials of 1692 and 93 are noted for their infamy. 19 people were hung on charges of witchcraft, and many more were imprisoned. Witch trials were a 16th and mid-17th century phenomena. Many people, mostly women, and mostly in Germany or the Holy Roman Empire, were executed as witches. It's estimated that as many as 40,000 were executed in Europe. While these trials and executions took place in both Catholic and Protestant areas, it would appear that more were killed in places controlled by Protestants. Convictions were often based on what was called spectral evidence. The alleged victims of witchcraft would claim to have been tormented by an image or vision of a person, and it was assumed that that person had given the devil permission to take on their appearance, and therefore they were a witch. Now, such a claim was difficult to refute, and it was only when the courts decided to reduce reliance on spectral evidence that most of the cases brought before the court in Salem were acquitted, and finally accusations ceased altogether. Meanwhile, in England, at the end of the 17th century, Thomas Bray was appointed by the Bishop of London as the commissary for the colony of Maryland. He recruited evangelists and gathered funds for the establishment of parish libraries there. Through Thomas Bray's initiative, the Society for Promoting Christian Knowledge was formed in 1698. And probably even of more significance was his establishment of the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in Foreign Parts in 1701. The SPG was more mission focused than the SPCK, and during the 18th century it supported several hundred men working among the British colonists, the African American slaves, and the indigenous Indians of North America. In our next video, we're going to examine the influence of so-called Christian mysticism. We're going to note movements such as Quietism and the Quakers, and key figures like Emanuel Swedenborg and George Fox, along with many others